And we pick up from where we left off the last day. Luisa says, one day we were in this contrast and the pain was so great that I couldn't stop crying. Now, in volume 1, Luisa is a teenager, so the crying is okay. When she gets to volume 20, it wouldn't be tolerated. You have to grow. So my good Jesus told me, I want to content you in everything. That's because she's giving herself completely to him. I feel so drawn towards you. That's because she is opening herself up completely to him, that I cannot do without doing what you want. Now notice it's the Lord who's telling Luisa that he wants to do what she wants. And it has got to be the other way around completely, hasn't it? If up until now I have removed the external life from you, that is, she was taken away from all normal social contacts, and I've manifested myself to you, now I want to draw your soul to me. So it's one thing to take away everything that hinders on the outside. It's quite another matter internally to go to the Lord. Because you know that it's not the habit that makes the monk. And it's not the building that makes the monk. It's what happens inside in the monk's heart that makes a monk. And so that's what he's saying here. Now that we've got rid of all the external distractions, let's deal with all the internal stuff. I want to draw your soul to me so that wherever I go, you may come along. Because in the divine will, wherever the divine will is, we go there. That's everywhere. In this way, you will be able to enjoy me more and bind yourself to me more intimately than you have done in the past. One morning, I don't remember well, but I think about 3 months had passed of my continuously staying in bed. And as I was in my usual state, her usual state, as you know, is an ecstatic state, my sweet Jesus came with a look all lovable as a young man of about 18 years of age. Now, very seldom does she see Jesus at that age. She either sees him as a child or at the time when he did his public ministry. Oh, how beautiful he was, with his golden hair all curly. He seemed to chain my thoughts, my affections, and my heart. That's your Deuteronomy 6:4. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. From his forehead, serene and spacious, one could admire the interior of his mind as from within a crystal, and one could discover his infinite wisdom, his imperturbable peace. Oh, how I felt my mind, my heart brighten up. Even more, before Jesus, my very passions are knocked down and do not dare to give me the slightest bother. I don't know if I'm wrong, but I believe that one cannot see this Jesus so beautiful if one is not in the most profound calm. That's a very important statement. Because the problem that we all have is that we're distracted by everyday life. We have all the stuff on the internet and your phones and all your gadgets and everything else to distract you absolutely. And you have whatever is going on in the family and around you and all the rest of it. And you're so distracted that if the Lord stood in front of you, you haven't enough attention to recognize him. So she's saying this profound calm. Now that's the peace that passes all understanding. That's Philippians 4:7. Philippians 4:7. So much so that the slightest breath of disturbance prevents one from receiving a sight so beautiful. Now, in the first 4 volumes, Jesus tells Luisa continuously that there must not be the slightest disturbance inside of you. So let me explain that to you. And that is, we who give spiritual direction to others, if a person comes and they explain a problem to you, you give an answer that they're not expecting. The answer is a question. And that is your problem on the outside or on the inside? And they look at you and say, what do you mean? I have a problem. I say, no. You can have a storm out there in Selbridge, but it's not in my house. The storm is kept out by all the walls of this house. So has the storm entered into your inner being and you are stormy? Or is the storm outside? That is the discernment that they need. And if they manage to say the storm is outside, say you're not having a problem, just offer it to the Lord. You're just having a cross. And just offer it with the sufferings of Jesus and offer it to the Lord. But if you're having a storm on the inside, you're having a real crisis because there's no room for God. but there's plenty of room for Satan to attack. Because if you're disturbed, Satan moves in. You have no idea. It's a bit like if somebody threw a stone at that window and created, the havoc that a stone can create on a window. The air gets in, the rain gets in. Now, Satan does that to the soul. If there's the remotest crack, he attacks. That's why this profound peace and stillness is what allows the Lord to reign and keeps all that evil out. Ah, yes, at just seeing the serenity of his adorable forehead, the infusion of peace that one receives in the interior is so great. Now, notice everything's infused. And I believe that there's no disaster or war most fierce which do not appease themselves before Jesus. Oh, my all and beautiful Jesus, if you communicate so much peace in the few moments you manifest yourself in this life, in such a way that one can suffer the most painful martyrdoms, the most humiliating pains, but with the most perfect tranquility. Now, that is what Luisa was called to. She's a victim soul. Now, that's the specific grace of victim souls. She says, what will it be like in paradise? Oh, how beautiful are his most pure eyes, sparkling with light. It's not like the light of the sun, that if one wants to look at it, it harms our sight. No. In Jesus, while being light, one can very well fix his gaze on it, and by just looking at the interior of his pupil of a dark sky blue, oh, how many things it would tell me. Now, beside that, you need to put the Song of Songs 5:12. That's the bride describing the bridegroom. Song of Songs 5:12. The beauty of his eyes is such that one of his gazes is enough to make me go outside of myself and run after him through paths and through mountains and through the earth and through the heavens. One single glance is enough to transform me into him. That's all Song of Songs. And make me feel a certain something divine descend upon me. Now, the next section is Song of Songs, chapter 5, verses 10 to 16. Song of Songs, chapter 5, verses 10 to 16. Who can tell then the beauty of his adorable face? His white complexion looks like snow coloured with a shade of roses, and the most beautiful ones. In his rosy cheeks, one discovers the greatness of his person with the most majestic look, fully divine, which strikes fear and reverence, and at the same time infuses such confidence that, as for myself, I have never found anyone who would give me the least shadow of confidence that my dear Jesus gives. Neither my parents, confessors, nor my sisters. You can see that her extensive connections are not very great. It's just her parents and her sisters and her immediate family. Ah, yes, that holy face, while being so majestic, is also so lovable. And that loveliness attracts one so much that the soul does not have the slightest doubt of being welcomed by Jesus, as ugly and sinful as she may see herself. Beautiful also is his nose, which descends to a very fine point, proportioned to his most sacred face. Gracious his mouth, small but extremely beautiful, and his finest lips of a scarlet colour. Now, if somebody was artistic, they could actually paint this. While he speaks, he contains so much graciousness that it is impossible to describe it. Sweet is the voice of my Jesus. It is gentle and it's harmonious. While he speaks, there is such fragrance coming out of his mouth that it seems that there is nothing like it on the earth. It is so penetrating as to penetrate everywhere. Now, people who have the privilege of having saints around them, and I know some people in this country have the privilege of having saints around them. Each of the saints has a particular perfume. And when you have a number of saints around you, you get a mixture of perfumes. And this is what is being described here, that the full conglomeration of all the perfumes of sanctity is in Jesus. The whole lot of them, the entire mixture, they're all there. So that represents all the virtues and all the attributes of God. So I want to put Hebrews 4:12 to 14 beside that. Oh, how many affections it produces. Affections is responses from us. But who can say everything? Then it is so pleasant that I believe no other pleasures can be found, as many as the ones that you will find in one single word of Jesus. Isaiah 55, 10 to 11. Yeah, one single word of his, the word that goes forth and creates. Now, throughout all of the 36 volumes, Jesus will describe his word as creative. In other words, when he speaks, it happens. That's exactly what Genesis says, that God said, let there be light, and there was light. God said this, and it happened. God said, and it happened. You go to the Gospels, Jesus said, go and wash in the pool of Siloam, and the man said, I went, and I washed, and I saw. It's a creative word. When the Lord speaks to us in the depths of our being, and if he says to you, for example, forgive, he not only gives you a command, he gives you the creative power to do it. It's much, much bigger. Like if one of us said forgive, we're simply saying the word and reminding you of something you ought to be doing. With him, it's completely different. He actually creates in you the ability to do it. It's a totally different thing altogether. I know somebody who was completely transformed, and I mean completely 100% transformed, because the Lord told him to forgive, and he forgave. And he forgave something massive. But once he was told to forgive, he had the ability to do something that before that was completely and totally impossible. And the result of it was an extraordinary transformation. So that's the one single word of Jesus. The voice of my Jesus is immensely powerful. It is operative, that means it's effective. And at every moment he speaks, he already operates that which he says. That's what I've just told you. Now, the creative word, you'll find that in Genesis chapter 1. You'll find it in John chapter 1, but throughout the gospel as well. Ah, yes, beautiful is his mouth, but it displays more of its beautiful grace in the act of speaking, while one can see those teeth so clear and so well arranged. Now, Luisa is doing exactly what the bride in the Song of Songs does, which is describe the bridegroom. And what she's doing is she's contemplating him. And she will do exactly the same thing when he's on the cross. And she will tell you exactly what he's like on the cross. And therefore she'll do all the reparations. She has seen his beauty beforehand and the destruction of that beauty in the crucifixion. And his breath of love comes out. Now, his breath of love, it's the Holy Spirit coming from him. But you'll read about it in John 20:22, that Jesus breathed it upon the apostles, and therefore they actually became a living church as a result of it. And so this breath of love comes out, igniting, darting through, and consuming the heart. Beautiful are his hands, soft, white, most delicate, with those fingers so perfectly crafted, and he moves them with such mastery as to be an enchantment. Oh, how beautiful you are, all beautiful, O my sweet Jesus. What I have said of your beauty is nothing. Rather, it seems to me that I've said a lot of nonsense. But what can I do? Forgive me, it is obedience that wants it. By myself, I would not have dared to say one word, knowing my insufficiency. She's done pretty well, hasn't she? Mm-hmm. So when she uses the expression, I think I've said a lot of nonsense, she means I'm not sure that I have communicated. So the next section then is about the breath of God. And I want to give you the Hebrew words, Ruach Adonai, R-U-A-C-H, R-U-A-C-H, Ruach Adonai, A-D-O-N-A-I. The Jewish people never pronounced the sacred name. And so instead of pronouncing the sacred name, they use the Lord. And the Lord in Hebrew is Adonai. Nowadays, modern Jewish people call God Hashem. Ha means the, and Shem means name. The name above all names, which St. Paul talks about. So, now while I was seeing Jesus in the appearance already described, he sent a breath from his mouth, which invested all of my soul. It seemed that through that breath, Jesus was drawing me towards himself. And I began to feel my soul going out of my body. That's in an out-of-the-body experience. I really felt it go out from all parts, from my head, from my hands, and even from my feet. Now, this will be the only time she'll tell you that. In future, she'll just simply say, I went out of myself. Since it was the first time that this was happening to me, within myself I began to say, now I die, the Lord has come to take me. Because usually the only time that your soul leaves your body is when you're going to die. But an out-of-the-body experience can be induced. In the past, people used what they called the straitjacket for prisoners that they really wanted to punish. And it was such a frighteningly suffocating experience that many of them, their souls went out of their bodies just to survive. And so it can be induced by ferocious pressure. People in the New Age movement use a terrible pressure of fasting and all kinds of stuff to produce an out-of-the-body experience. And so they claim that they have astral projections and all this kind of stuff. I don't know if you've studied that. But they are not going to a place where the Lord is, wherever they're going. That's the amazing thing. Whereas when Luisa has an out-of-the-body experience, she's going immediately into the presence of the Lord, and her entire experience is an experience with the Lord. In other words, she's not having an out-of-the-body experience for the sake of it. Whereas the New Age people think that they are really advanced spiritually if they have an out-of-the-body experience. I actually passed by a group of New Agers having a meeting in a Catholic monastery, if you wouldn't mind. I won't say where. And they had all levitated off the floor. So they all thought that they were very spiritual. And I knew that if I laughed loud enough that they'd all fall. Because it was not what God was doing to them. It was something that they were inducing the body to do. But the whole lot of them were approximately a foot off the floor. So I crept past and I said, the poor souls. But I knew if I laughed aloud, they'd fall, because it would break the power. But then they'd probably kill me, so I wanted to live. So since this was happening for the first time, then she described it. Yeah, she thought she was going to die. When I saw myself out of the body, the soul had the same feeling as that of the body. This is a little bit of revelation for you. It's actually very good. Because people who have had near-death experiences will tell you they had all their feelings. We have spiritual senses as well as physical senses. And when we're in the body, we're so aware of the physical senses that we're not really aware of the spiritual senses that we have. But when people go deeply into prayer and into contemplation, you become aware of the spiritual senses. And that's why Luisa says, I was feeling the same. With this difference that the body contains flesh, nerves and bones, while the soul doesn't. It is a body of light. Very interesting. Why would she use that expression? Because the soul goes back to God, who is light. And the soul can only be full of love to go back to God, who is love. So the only two things you can take with you to heaven are light and love. You can't take anything else. So I felt a fear within me, but Jesus continued to send me his breath and told me, if being deprived of me gives you so much pain, now come together with me and I want to console you. And Jesus began his flight. Now, he's introducing her to something very important, and that is that she's going to be in bed in which you would die of boredom and tedium, if nothing else, for 64 years. But he's going to take her almost on a daily basis out. And he's going to take her all over the world. He's going to take her out into the stars. He's going to take her among the planets. He's going to take her to heaven. He's going to take her to purgatory. And you need to know that if we don't have the balance, we couldn't cope. So if she's to be stuck in that bed, she also must see and hear and experience, and she must get out of the bed. Am I making sense to you? If you have sorrow, the Lord makes sure that there's some joy there to balance it out. When St. Therese of Lisieux was dying, she had an experience of the Passion of Jesus spiritually. But in the middle of it, the Lord gave her 2 weeks off to get her breath back, is the way I would put it. But the doctors were completely confused that for 2 weeks, none of the symptoms were there. And of course, they started saying she's making it up. And she died soon afterwards. But he gave her that little break, and we need that. You know that Padre Pio's community used to tease him and say he was the only one who knew how to get around the vow of obedience, because he was seen all over the world in bilocation, you see. And everybody else would need permission, and they'd need an airline ticket and what else. And Padre Pio's answer was, but I leave my body with you. It's the body that causes the airline ticket. So Jesus began his flight, and I began mine. That this is out in the spirit world after him. And we went round throughout the whole vault of the heavens. Now, the vault of the heavens is what we call the sky, and the sun, moon, and stars above it. Oh, how beautiful it was to stroll together with Jesus. Now, put beside that Genesis 3:8. Because the last time we heard of God strolling with anybody, it was in Genesis 3:8 that God walked with Adam in the cool of the day. That's Genesis 3:8. And I would lean my head upon his shoulder. Now notice my head and my arm and all the rest of it, because you see the soul has exactly the same shape as your body. I have had a friend, a wonderful lady in England. She's long since gone to the Lord, but when she had her first near-death experience and her soul left her body in the middle of the night, and then the Lord told her, it wasn't her time, and she had to go back, and she said, she really, when she looked at the size of the body, she said, no, I won't fit in there. Because you see, once you go into the spirit world, you expand. Everything in you expands. And she said, I watched in total horror as my body, as I, she said, had to shrink to fit into that thing. Into every single part of the body. Because once we go into that incredible freedom on the spirit side, the body seems awfully small and confined and everything. So I would lean my head upon his shoulder, and one arm around his shoulders and the other hand in his hand. Now look, the two of them are walking like lovers, aren't they? Yeah. She has her head on his shoulder with one arm around his shoulders. Now that's intimate enough, isn't it? And he was holding her hand. And then Jesus would lean on me, and when we reached certain places which were more inundated with iniquity. So, how my good Jesus suffered, she said, in these places of iniquity, I could see more clearly the sufferings of his adorable heart. That's Psalm 36, verse 9. In your light, we see light. Psalm 36, verse 9. Now, when she's in this out-of-the-body experience, she sees everything from God's perspective. That's what makes the saints and the prophets different to us. Because if we're looking at something from our perspective, it's limited. Let me illustrate it for you. One year I gave a retreat in London just before Christmas. It's a definition of madness. And I decided before I came home that I would go down to Oxford Street and at least visit the darn place. Well, that's total madness before Christmas. The crowds were so great that the police were shunting us in and out of shops, whether you wanted to go in or not. The only safe place was walk beside the bus, which weren't allowed to go out there. And I remember looking at this vast crowd when I got out of one of the shops. I wasn't interested in what they were asking us to do. And I said, Lord, how many cows would you have to kill to give any of these people a bit of meat for lunch? And the question was overwhelming. How much bread would you have to make just to give them one slice or to give them a bun? And every question I asked was just overwhelming because it was just a vast sea of humanity. But the following day when I was flying over London to come home to Ireland, I looked down at 13.6 million people and I said, God bless London. No problem. Different perspective. You see, the first time you're standing in the middle of the problem, yes, and all you can see is the problem. That's why I'm illustrating it. Mm-hmm. The other way, you're seeing it from God's point of view, and it's not a problem at all. We only explained this in volume 1, because after that then presumed you understand what's going on in the out-of-the-body experiences. When the Lord takes Luisa out, then she will see everything from God's point of view. And therefore she will be able to give us new perspective on things. Because you can only give what you have. So Jesus said to her, my beloved, help me. Now, you know that her whole story begins with him asking her for help. for I cannot take any more. Now that's the terrible sin that's going on the earth. And while saying this, he would draw his lips close to mine, and he would pour such bitterness that I would feel mortal pains in feeling that liqueur. Now, do you remember the last day I told you he gave her milk? That gave her life and strength. Well, the liqueur is sufferings. Obviously, she's calling it that because it must look like it, because we use language that we have. So it was so very bitter, it would enter into me, and I would feel it as if many knives, pricks, arrows were piercing me through. Now, these knives, pricks, and arrows that she's talking about are specific sins that are attacking. In some, an atrocious torment would form in all of my body, my limbs, and as the soul would go back into the body, it would make the body participate in these sufferings. So initially, she was experiencing them totally spiritually, and then she goes back and the body experiences it as well. Who can tell the pains, she said. Jesus himself was the witness of it, because the others could not mitigate my pains, since I would be in that state of loss of consciousness. Now, she refuses point blank to use the word ecstasy. And she just simply says loss of consciousness, which means I'm not available to you, but I'm available to God, which is what ecstasy is. And they would wait for the presence of the confessor, for then they would also mitigate at the call of obedience. So Jesus alone could help me when he could see that my nature could not take any more and reach the very extremes, when there was nothing left for me but to breathe my last. Oh, how many times death made fun of me, but the day will come when I will make fun of her. Now, unfortunately, she's to wait quite a long time, and she's going to be toing and froing on this subject. She had such a desire for heaven. It's totally amazing. So, Jesus would come, he would take me in his arms and draw me close to his heart. I want you to put John 13:37 there, where John the Beloved put his head on Jesus' heart. Oh, how I'd feel life coming back into me. And then he would pour a most sweet liquor from his lips, and in this way the pains would mitigate. Now notice one of the liquors is bitter and the other one is sweet. Other times he would take me around together with him. If there were sins of blasphemy against charity and others, he would pour those awful bitters into me. If then there were sins of dishonesty, he would pour something of a stinking rottenness. And I would return into myself and I would feel that stink as well. And the stench would be such that it would revolt my stomach and I would feel faint. Now what she's getting is a graphic lesson as to the horror of these sins. And the problem is we're living in such a sinful world that we pay no attention to dishonesty and this and that and the other. And sometimes after taking food, she said, I would bring it up. And I would feel that rot come out of my mouth mixed with the blood. In other words, the rot that was given to her is real. If it comes out of her mouth mixed with the food that she's vomited up, then it was real. In other words, it's not just spiritual. And this is one of the things that you have to sort of come to grips with Luisa, that the presence of Jesus in her is real. It's not just grace. And the sufferings she has are very real as well. So in the next paragraph, she's going to talk about the sins of good people. Now, if you remember the story of the prodigal son in Luke 15, if you write Luke 15 there, the so-called good one was the elder brother. Do you remember? And the elder brother was fine until he opened his mouth. And then you realised he wasn't a good one, because out of his mouth came bitterness and unforgiveness and resentment and all the rest of it. And these are all horrible sins. But unfortunately, they're the sins of good people. And just because they're not robbing banks and they're not abusing others and they're not killing others, they think they're grand. I've even heard people say, but I've never robbed a bank. I said, well, go and do it then and get it off your chest. In other words, they're using that as their definition of being a saint. Do you know what I mean? I said, if you're going to be a saint, sin has got to be on another planet. So make sure you write down elder brother there, because this is elder brother syndrome, it's called. Sometimes then he would bring me into churches, and even there my good Jesus was offended. Oh, how awfully those works reached his heart. Holy works, yes, but done roughly. Oh dear. Those prayers empty of interior spirit. That piety which is false and only seemingly right on the outside, which seemed to give more insult than honour to Jesus. Ah yes, that holy, pure, upright heart could not receive those works done so badly. Oh, how many times he lamented. Before we go on, beside that put Habakkuk, Habb, Habakkuk 1:13. Your eyes are too holy to look upon evil. That's for all of this awful stuff that's done in church that people think is religious. But if it's empty of interior spirit, it's nothing. Now, the false piety only apparent, empty of interior spirit, I want you to put beside that Matthew 15, verses 1 to 10, where Jesus literally attacks the scribes and Pharisees on that very subject, and he says, these people honour me with lip service, but their hearts are far from me. So, in receiving the very sacraments, instead of coming out purified, they come out dirtier. In other words, they commit sins actually in the reception of the sacraments. Ah yes, how much pain it was for Jesus to see people receiving communion sacrilegiously. Oh dear. Priests celebrating the holy sacrifice of the Mass in mortal sin, out of habit, and some, it is a horror to say, even out of self-interest. I don't know how a priest says Mass out of self-interest. I haven't got that one at all. I just don't understand that. Oh, how many, I can understand the mortal sin or the sacrilegious thing. Oh, how many times my Jesus made me see these scenes so sorrowful. How many times while the priest was celebrating the sacrosanct mystery, Jesus is forced to go into his hands because he is called by the priestly authority. That's the consecration. One would see those hands dripping with rot blood or smeared with mud. That's a priest living an immoral life. Now we have the problem today of priests and bishops actually practicing homosexuality. This is a perfect description. It's really, really incredibly sad. Oh, how pitiful then was the state of Jesus, so holy, so pure, in those hands which were horrifying at the mere sight. It seemed he wanted to escape from between those hands, but he was forced to stay until the species of bread and wine would be consumed. How long is that? 15 minutes exactly. So in case you'll forget, write it down. It's exactly 15 minutes. So in the next section then, she's going to talk about bad priests. Sometimes, while remaining there with the priest, Jesus would come hurriedly to me, all lamenting. And before I could say it, he himself would say to me, daughter, let me pour it into you. I can take no more. Have pity on my state, which is too sorrowful. Have patience, let us suffer together. And while saying this, he would pour from his mouth into mine. But who can tell what he poured? It seemed to be a bitter poison, a fetid rot, mixed with food so hard, disgusting and nauseating, and sometimes it wouldn't go down. Who can tell then the suffering of this pouring of Jesus produced? If he himself had not sustained me, I certainly would have died. Yet he would pour in me but the smallest bit. What would be the part for Jesus who contained tons and tons of it, she said. Oh, how awful sin is. Now, the victim soul and the saint both need to come to a point of understanding the horror of sin, because not only will they repudiate it in their own lives, but they will make reparation for others. And in the divine will, making reparation and substituting for others is a very big part of our ministry, because otherwise they won't be saved if somebody doesn't make reparation for them and substitute for them. So what is Jesus doing here? He's pouring the sins of the church into Luisa. Now, we need an awful lot of people today making reparation for the sins of the church. Otherwise, a terrifying chastisement will come. Ah, Lord, let everyone know it, so that all may flee from this monster so horrible. The monster is sin. But while I would see these scenes so sorrowful, other times he would also make me see scenes so consoling and beautiful as to be enrapturing. Now, do you see, he needs to compensate her. It can't all be horrible. Human nature can't take that. She needs the balance. And this was to see good and holy priests celebrating the sacrosanct mysteries. O God, how high, great and sublime is their ministry. How beautiful it was to see the priests celebrating Mass and Jesus transformed into him. It seemed that it was not the priest but Jesus himself that celebrated the holy sacrifice, and sometimes he would make the priest disappear completely, and Jesus alone would celebrate the Mass, and I would listen to him. Now, I have known people who have actually seen that instead of seeing the priest, they actually saw Jesus celebrating the Mass. And I'm talking about people in Ireland now, I'm not talking about people in far-flung places. Oh, how touching it was to see Jesus recite those prayers, do all those ceremonies and movements that the priest does. Who can tell how consoling it was for me to attend, not to see, these Masses together with Jesus. How many graces I received, how much light and how many things I understood. Comprehend is a word that's used quite frequently. Understanding is a word that we use. But since these are past things, I don't remember them so clearly, so I kept silent. So you'll notice that in all of this, she's getting very deep understanding as to the nature of sin, very deep understanding as to the nature of the Mass and the sacraments. In other words, Jesus is evangelizing her and giving her the true doctrine so that she can actually base her life on that. And when we come into a deep relationship with the Lord, volumes 1 to 4 are actually necessary to make sure that anything missing in the foundations of our evangelization can be filled in as well. So the next paragraph is an interlude where Jesus reacts to Luisa wanting to be silent, you see. Luisa has this temptation that she doesn't really want to explain things because she thinks she won't understand. And it's going to be a battle between Jesus and Luisa, and also the priests and Luisa, to get her eventually to say everything. Now, she will fight that one tooth and nail. But gradually, you'll have to get up to about volume 20 before you'll get full messages from her. That is, you can get a 4 A4 page as one message. In other words, she's saying everything. But at the beginning, she doesn't want to do it. She says, no, you wouldn't understand, or it'll be too long, or whatever. And she makes all these excuses. And then Jesus begins to say to her that it is extremely important that she writes. Now, you have to understand that in volume 1, she does not know that this material is going out of her room. The only person she thinks will ever read it is the priest. So she doesn't understand why she's being told to write every single detail. If she had realised that we'd be studying this a century later, she would have died. So it becomes a crisis deeper and deeper for her when she begins to realise this is actually something the Lord is going to publish. But as I am saying this, Jesus has moved in my interior and he has called me. He doesn't want me to do that. In other words, keep silent and not explain things. Ah, Lord, how much patience it takes with you, she says. That's a fantastic expression, isn't it? We say that of each other, but who would dare to say that about the Lord? Well then, I will content you, O sweet love. I will say a few little things, but give me your grace to be able to manifest them, because by myself I would not dare to utter one word about mysteries so sublime and so profound. So Jesus wants her to say more about the Mass, which you're going to get in the next paragraph. Now, while seeing Jesus or the priest celebrating the divine sacrifice, Jesus would make me understand that in the Mass there is all the depth of our most holy religion. Sacrosanct means most holy. Ah yes, the Mass tells us everything. And it speaks to us about everything. The Mass reminds us of our redemption. It speaks to us step by step about the pains that Jesus suffered for us. It also manifests to us his immense love. for he was not content with dying on the cross, but he wanted to continue his state of victim in the Most Holy Eucharist. The Mass also tells us that our bodies, decayed, reduced to ashes by death, will rise again on the day of judgment together with Jesus. You'll get that in John chapter 6. Anyone who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has life, and so on. So it will rise again on the day of judgment together with Christ to immortal and glorious life. Now this is described very well in 1 Corinthians 15. And it's approximately the first 10 verses, approximately. Jesus made me understand that the most consoling thing for a Christian and the highest and most sublime mysteries of our holy religion are Jesus in the sacrament. Now, when she says Jesus in the sacrament, you mean the Holy Eucharist. You would get the impression from here that there was only one sacrament instead of 7. So right down there, the Holy Eucharist, because that's the only sacrament she's actually speaking about. So the most sublime mysteries of our holy religion are Jesus in the most holy Eucharist and the resurrection of our bodies to glory. Isn't that amazing? I wouldn't have expected her to say those two. I would expect her to include them, but to put in a few other things as well. These are profound mysteries, she says, which we will understand only beyond the stars. A lovely expression, isn't it? But Jesus in the most holy Eucharist makes us almost touch them with our own hands. In other words, that you get to the point where you can actually touch this mystery at a deeper level. But then you have got to be very quiet after communion. And one of the terrible mistakes that's made today is that people sing even inappropriate stuff. By that I mean that they're not singing about communion, distracting you. And then within 5 minutes you're up and you're out talking. And that sacred presence is physically there for 15 minutes. That's why, when this kind of stuff started in churches, I made a decision, and I've kept it ever since, that I leave the church instantly, so that I'm not talking to anybody, so that I can have my silence on the way home to do my Thanksgiving, because people are taking it from you without realizing what they're doing, and they're taking an incredible treasure from you. And see, the problem is if you stay sitting in the bench, somebody will come over and talk to you. That's why I leave. And so I always look like someone in a desperate hurry to leave the church. But I am, because I want to make the most of this 15 minutes. I mean, that sacred presence is only there 15 minutes. So why on earth would you not benefit from it? As a lovely countryman said to me one day, "I've God all to myself, imagine." I said, "You got it." It's the most wonderful expression. He actually got it. "I've God all to myself." And he said, "I suddenly realized I ask other people to pray and I have him for myself." Isn't that wonderful? That man started doing all-night vigils when he realized he had God all to himself. These are profound mysteries, and the Lord wants us to really enter into them. First, his resurrection. Second, his state of annihilation under that species, though it is certain that Jesus is there, present, alive and real. So beside that, I want you to put Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 to 11. In other words, his state was divine. He humbles himself, becomes one of us, crucified and risen. It's certain that he is there. Then, once those species are consumed, his real presence no longer exists. In other words, after the 15 minutes. That's why it's the most important 15 minutes of your life. And as the species are consecrated again, he comes again to assume his sacramental state. So, Jesus in the most holy Eucharist reminds us of the resurrection of our bodies to glory. Just as Jesus, when his sacramental state ceases, resides in the womb of God, in other words, goes back to his origin in God, his Father, and it's the same for us. When our lives cease, our souls go and make their dwelling in heaven in the womb of God while our bodies are consumed. So, one can say that they no longer exist. But then with the prodigy of the omnipotence of God, our bodies will acquire new life, and uniting with the soul will go together to enjoy the eternal beatitude. Can there be anything more consoling for a human heart than the fact that not only the soul but also the body will be beatified with eternal contentments? And there's where the worldly people today are completely deceived. They want all their contentments now, and then they'll have nothing on the other side, which is really sad. It seems to me that on that day, that's the day of resurrection, it will happen as when the sky is starry and the sun comes out. What happens? When with its immense light, the sun absorbs the stars and makes them disappear. But the stars are there. It's just you don't see them. It's just that the light is so great. Beside that, I want you to put the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 3, and that is that the saints shine like stars in God's heaven. I read a description up in volume 14, was it? That Jesus said that some people who barely do the absolute minimum to be saved, he said, they're the ones that will be like stardust, floating around the place, but they won't be stars and they won't be planets and they won't be these great constellations because they only barely made it to the other side. It's very interesting that he uses this expression all the time. So even though the immense light of the sun is there, the stars do actually exist, and it's only when the sun decides to go to bed that you see the stars again. And in all of these writings, the sun represents God, because God is light. And when you realize that in these writings the sun represents God, I have to bring you back to a little reflection, and that is, if you go back to the time of the pharaohs, the people were worshipping the sun as God. And the thing is, they were only partially wrong, because the sun is the source of light, is the source of heat, is the source of joy, is the source of all the fecundity on the earth and blah, 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 is the source of health and all the rest of it. They just didn't know there was a person behind it. And the way I describe that is that it's a wonderful moment for a mother and her child when the infant sucking the breast looks up and realises there's a person behind the food. And the little finger goes up to touch. Am I right or am I right? And it's a great moment for the mother as well, because the mother is being acknowledged as the origin of that life. Now, the pharaohs only needed to make one step to go beyond worshipping the actual sun itself, to go to worship the person behind it, a God who is light. And the sadness is that God sent Moses to tell them, and they couldn't take it. It's sad. But it's even worse then at the time of Christ, when the light of the world, Jesus himself, came and the children of Israel wouldn't accept him. And it's even worse again that today, after 2,000 years of Christianity, the Western world, which was evangelized first, has just rejected the light of the world. So the sun is God and all the blessed souls are the stars. That's what Daniel says, that we shine like stars. With his immense light, God will absorb all of us into himself in such a way that we all exist in God. Now, in one of the higher volumes, Luisa says that she was taken up to heaven. She was taken up to heaven a number of times, and she went looking for Our Blessed Lady and couldn't find her. And she said that she had to go very, very far into the Most Blessed Trinity to find her, because she was so high. Isn't that fantastic? And I'm giving it to here to let you hear what's being said here, that we're absorbed into that light. But when she was able to penetrate very deeply into the Most Blessed Trinity, she could then see Our Blessed Lady in a very special place all by herself. So God will absorb us all within himself in such a way that we will exist in God and will swim in the immense sea of God. Oh, how many things Jesus in the Most Holy Eucharist tells us, but who can tell them all? It would be really too long. Now, this is Luisa in Volume 1, not wanting to say everything, you see. If the Lord allows it, I will reserve saying something else on other occasions. In other words, she's going to stop now, no matter who says what. So, during these exits that the Lord would make me do, that is the out-of-the-body experiences, Sometimes he would renew the promise of the marriage, which I had already mentioned. Who can tell the ardent yearnings that the Lord infused in me for that mystical marriage to take place? Many times I would solicit him, telling him, "Most sweet spouse, hurry, no longer delay my intimate union with you. Please let us bind each other with stronger bonds of love." Now, the thing is, you won't become a saint unless you want it. I can tell you that for absolute certain. You don't become a saint by mistake. Just as I will never become a pilot taking an airplane off the ground unless I decide to be a pilot and I decide to go for the training and I decide to pass the exams. Does that make sense? In the same way, I will not become a saint unless I decide I want to go there. I'm telling you that because many good people don't make a clear decision that I want what the Lord wants for me. They just sort of go along, but they don't make a clear decision that I actually want it. And if you tell the Lord very clearly that you want it, he will train you for that. But if he's not hearing anything from you, he's saying, well, they don't really want it, so why should I waste the training? Would you waste training on someone who, didn't really want to be a pilot, but they wouldn't mind sort of learning a couple of things about it? Would you waste the money and the time? No, you would not. Unless you were a person who didn't know what to do with their money. So in the same way, here you have Luisa saying to the Lord, I want this mystical marriage. Now, you're going to have a disaster for life if two persons, male and female, if we stay with reality, do not both want the marriage. If only one of them wants the marriage and the other one is sort of saying, well, okay, yeah, I'll go along with it. You're not going to have a decent marriage, are you? But if both of them really want it, then you're going to have something dynamic and something great. Am I talking English? Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's the same spiritually as well. So she's telling him to hurry up. Oh, please let us bind each other with the stronger bonds of love so that no one may ever again be able to separate us, even for simple instance. So when you get up to the volumes over volume 20, you will hear Jesus calling Luisa, my inseparable Luisa. So it happened. She actually got there. And the only other person he calls my inseparable is his mother. And Jesus would correct me about one thing and then about another. We would say, teach me, rather than just correct me. I remember that one day he said, everything that is on the earth, everything you must remove, not only from your heart, but also from your body. That's Deuteronomy 6:4-10. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and being. Now, because Luisa is being called to a very exalted relationship with Jesus, more is demanded of her than will be demanded of you and me. Because we're not called to exactly the same thing that she was called to. So a separation from the world and from material things for her had to be absolutely drastic. You cannot understand how harmful are the slightest earthly shadows and how much they hinder love. These shadows are our attachments. Now, living in the ordinary world as all of us are, you probably don't even know you have any. But it can be illustrated much more easily if you talk about a situation that I actually was involved with, giving a retreat to contemplative nuns. And one of them had been given a very special pen for her silver jubilee. Now, these women have a solemn vow of poverty. And so from the day she took her vows, she owned nothing. And all of a sudden she was allowed to keep this pen. And so she was telling me about this pen. I could see that she absolutely loved it and all the rest of it. And I decided I had to be the baddie, And I said, is that pen going to get you into purgatory? Your poverty was going to get you straight up. Don't let something as obnoxious as a pen make you experience fire. And, they were all looking at me as if I was, baddie number one. Do you know what I mean? I said the greatest temptation is that you cling to something that is nothing. Now, let me tell you, John of the Cross said that. John of the Cross said, if a bird is tied to a tree and cannot fly, it's a slave, isn't it? It's tragic. But is it more tragic if it is tied by a rope or a thread? If a bird is tied to a tree by a thread, that's your pen, or something little. It's much more tragic to be enslaved to something small than something great. And the problem with good people who want to be a saint and want to get close to the Lord is that it's the tiny things that they can cling to. It's the small things. I give you that just as a piece of wisdom. It might save you a few years of struggle. Because you'll say to yourself, no, I'm not letting that put me into purgatory. No way. And the pen is only an example. It could be anything. It could be absolutely anything. And the amazing thing is it very often is something small. That this is mine, nobody's having this one. So just to be very careful about it, and that's what Jesus is saying to her, that the earthly shadows, that's the little bits of things that you cling on to. Sometimes it's not a pen, it's not outside of yourself, it can be your own opinion. I had a friend who was always 100% right. So what was I? 100% wrong. Could you have a discussion? No. You could only have a dictation. So I used to allow the gentleman do as much talking as he could, and I'd eat my dinner. And then one day he said, "You haven't spoken." I said, "No, I haven't." What's the point in speaking if he's 100% right? So we can actually have things we cling on to on the inside. Sometimes you cling on to an opinion you have about another person. Oh, very dangerous. Because people change all the time as they move either forwards or backwards or whatever. And so if we hold a particular opinion about a person, it can be that we are holding them in judgment. So just be careful that the thing you cling on to can be outside of you, like the pen, or it could be inside of you either. So Jesus says they're very harmful and they hinder love. Now, hinder love meaning going to that union with God. Immediately, Luisa said, "If I have something else that must be removed, tell me, for I'm ready to do it." Now, she was extraordinarily generous with the Lord. But as I was saying this, I myself, watch this, I realized I had a gold ring on my finger, portraying the image of the crucifix. Now, isn't that holy? And immediately I said to him, "Holy spouse, do you want to take it off? Do you want me to take it off?" And he said, "Since I myself will give you a more precious, more beautiful ring, which will be my living image, have my living image impressed on it, and every time you will look at it in your heart, not on your finger, you will receive new arrows of love." That one isn't necessary. Now, if the Lord is talking to you like this, there's always a reason why he's doing it. It only dawned on Louise, oops, I have a ring. So because this is my last session that I'm doing with you, I'm going to go on for the next little while because we're going to do the spiritual marriage in the next paragraph. The longed-for day finally arrived after not a little suffering. I remember that it was almost 1 year that I had been continuously in bed. It was the day of the purity of Mary Most Holy. That's February the 2nd, isn't it? On the night before that day, my lover Jesus made himself seen, all festive. He drew near me, took my heart in his hands, because that's what marriage is about. It's about the heart, isn't it? And he looked at it over and over again. He dusted it. I love that. And then he gave it back to me. And then he took a garment of immense beauty, whose background seemed to be a surface of gold streaked with various colours. You remember Joseph and his multicoloured garment?
Yeah.
And he clothed me with that garment. Then he took 2 gems as if they were earrings, and he bejewelled my ears. So he's obviously not against earrings. Some of you might like that. Then he adorned my neck and my arms, so he's not against the necklace either, and surrounded my forehead with a crown of immense value, all enriched with precious stones and gems, all refulgent with light. Now, everything that comes from him, of course, is light, because he is light. And it seems to me that those lights were as many voices which resounded among themselves, speaking in clear notes of the beauty, power, fortitude, and all the other virtues of my holy spouse, Jesus. Who can tell what I understood and in what sea of consolation my soul was swimming in, but it's impossible to say it. Now put beside that 1 Corinthians 2:9. Things that the eye has seen and the ear has heard and the heart has, what the Lord has prepared for those who love him, but we're not able to say it. Because the problem is when you're in the out-of-the-body experience, you have the spiritual language, you come back into the body, and that spiritual language doesn't communicate. You have to somehow say it in our worldly language, and then the person who has experienced that exalted thing finds that this worldly language doesn't express it. You know, it's like Sister Faustina saying she didn't like the painting. She said, that's not like him. And yet it was the description she actually gave. So it was accurate, but of course it wasn't what she really saw. He couldn't communicate that divine presence and that divine beauty. Now, while he was crowning my forehead, Jesus said to me, most sweet spouse, I place this crown upon you so that nothing may be missing in order to make you worthy of being my spouse. But then, after our wedding is finished, I will take you with me to heaven to keep it for you at the moment of death. In other words, the crown was going to be her crown of glory. Finally, he took a veil and covered me completely with it from head to foot, and then he left me that way. It seemed to me that there was a great meaning in that veil, because the demons, in seeing me all covered in that veil, were so frightened and had such fear of me that they fled, terrified. Whatever it was, they got the message. The very angels were around me with such veneration that I myself was confused and full of blushing. So there you have the Lord having put this extraordinary protection around her. And the demons couldn't touch her at all. One morning, on the same day, Jesus made himself seen again, all affable, sweet, and majestic, and together with his most holy mother and Saint Catherine. Now we're going to have to find out which Catherine it is, because there's a whole lot of Catherines. I think it's Siena. Yeah, first the angels sang a hymn, while Saint Catherine assisted me, and Blessed Mother took my hand, and Jesus put the ring on my finger. Then we embraced, and he kissed me, and so did Blessed Mother. Then we had a conversation all of love. Jesus told me of the great love that he had for me, and I also told him of the love I had for him. The Most Holy Virgin made me understand the great grace that I had received, and that the correspondence that would be required of me, and so on. Now, I'm going to stop here, but just tell you that put a heading over the next paragraph, and you can start there with Imelda, and that is my new married life. Because it's one thing to have a wedding, it's another matter then you have to move into a completely new way of life. And we'll leave it there for the moment.